97 envelopes sat in a cardboard box on a folding table, each one stamped with a red seal, each one addressed to the same house on the same quiet street. 97 violation notices. 97 fines. 97 small cruelties disguised as community standards. The camera of memory would later linger on that box the way investigators linger on evidence, because that was exactly what it would become. But on the morning this story begins, nobody thought of paperwork as a weapon. They thought of it as Tuesday. Vanessa Caldwell walked the same route every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, dressed in a charcoal blazer even though no meeting required it, a clipboard tucked under one arm like a scepter. She was the president of the Homeowners Association for Ashford Point, a title she had held for nearly a decade, and she wore it the way some people wear a crown they were never quite given the right to keep. Her rule was simple, or so she told anyone who would listen. Nobody gets an exception. Standards protect property values. Somebody has to enforce them. What she did not say, because she barely admitted it to herself, was that she loved the fear in people's eyes when they saw her clipboard rise. She loved the way neighbors straightened their porch furniture the moment her car rounded the corner. Power, for Vanessa, was not a responsibility. It was a taste she had developed a hunger for. At the end of that same street stood house number 18, modest and well-kept, with a wraparound porch and a maple tree that had been there longer than the neighborhood itself. It belonged to Ethan Brooks, a man of 45 who kept to himself, who nodded politely at gatherings and left early, who mowed his lawn on schedule and painted his fence the approved shade of gray. He was an architect by training, though nobody in Ashford Point seemed to know or care. To them, he was simply the quiet man at number 18, the one who never argued, the one who seemed, in Vanessa's private estimation, like the easiest target on the street. Over 11 months, the fines came for Ethan like weather. A mailbox painted a shade too dark. Grass measured at 2¼ inches instead of 2. A porch light left on past 10 in the evening. A car parked 6 inches over an invisible line only Vanessa seemed able to see. Curtains the wrong color. A rocking chair deemed unsightly. Each violation arrived in its own envelope, sealed in red, delivered with the precision of a woman who treated her clipboard like scripture. 97 letters, 97 fines. And through every single one of them, Ethan Brooks said nothing. He did not argue at the mailbox. He did not raise his voice at the monthly meetings he rarely attended. He simply opened each envelope, read it once, and carried it into a back room of his house that had slowly, quietly, become something like an archive. There was a particular rhythm to how Vanessa chose her targets, one that anybody watching closely might have recognized as strategy rather than randomness. She never fined the loudest homeowners on the street, the ones with connections to the county commissioner or a cousin who practiced law. She never touched the family on the corner whose patio furniture had been left out through 3 consecutive winters, because that family hosted the annual holiday gathering Vanessa liked to attend. Her enforcement, if anyone had bothered to chart it, followed the shape of convenience rather than the shape of fairness. Ethan Brooks was convenient. He had no spouse to advocate loudly on his behalf at meetings, no children whose friendships with other neighborhood children might complicate things socially, no obvious circle of allies who would rally around him if the fines grew severe. He was, in the coldest possible sense, an efficient choice. What made the campaign sting more than its unfairness was its precision. Vanessa did not simply invent violations out of nothing. She stretched real, minor imperfections into disqualifying offenses through sheer force of interpretation. A porch light that stayed on 11 minutes past the community curfew became, in her letters, a persistent disregard for shared living standards. A single blade of grass measured at 2¼ inches became evidence of ongoing neglect. She had a gift, uncomfortable to witness, for making the smallest infractions sound like moral failures, and she deployed that gift against Ethan with a consistency she never showed toward anyone else on the street. The neighbors noticed, of course, because neighbors always notice. They began to avoid him, not out of dislike, but out of a survival instinct nobody wanted to name aloud. Nobody wanted to become the next name on Vanessa's clipboard. Better to let the quiet man at number 18 take the fire alone. Better to assume he would eventually sell the house and disappear, the way so many of Vanessa's other targets had disappeared over the years, worn down by fines and certified letters until moving away felt like the only form of peace available. That was the pattern everyone expected. That was the story they thought they were watching. On the evening she signed the 98th letter, Vanessa sat at her kitchen table with a satisfied little smile, the kind of smile that comes from believing a long campaign is finally about to pay off. She pressed her pen to the paper, signed her name with a flourish, and slid the letter into its envelope. This time she would break him, she told herself. This time the fine would be large enough, the accusations serious enough, that he would have no choice but to put up a sign and walk away. She sealed the envelope, tapped it twice against the table like a gavel, and said the words out loud to an empty kitchen, certain nobody would ever hold her to them. This time he sells the house. She had no idea that on that same evening, in a house at the far end of the street, another envelope was already being prepared, one with her name on it, one that would travel through a very different kind of system than the one she controlled. The campaign against Ethan did not happen by accident. Vanessa began targeting him with a deliberateness that, looked at closely, resembled obsession more than oversight. She drove past his house before her official inspection hours, hunting for anything her clipboard could translate into a violation. A tree branch, 2 inches too tall, became a citation. A trash bin left at the curb 1 hour early became a citation. A garage door left open for 15 minutes while he unloaded groceries became a citation. The color of a curtain glimpsed through a window became a citation. Even the placement of a porch chair, angled slightly toward the street instead of away from it, became, in Vanessa's telling, a violation of aesthetic harmony. The rest of the neighborhood watched this campaign unfold and drew the obvious lesson from it. Do not become interesting to Vanessa Caldwell. At block parties, conversations about the fines were traded in lowered voices, the way people discuss a storm that has already flooded someone else's basement. Vanessa herself made no secret of her success. At the community mailboxes, at the grocery store, at the annual barbecue nobody wanted to attend, she liked to remind people of her record. Nobody wins against the association, she would say, adjusting her sunglasses, letting the sentence hang in the air like a threat dressed up as pride. And yet Ethan never gave her the confrontation she seemed to be fishing for. He never shouted. He never slammed a door. He answered every notice with a calm, procedural reply, always on time, always citing the exact section of the governing documents that applied, always attaching whatever photograph or measurement the situation required. His letters were polite to the point of being clinical. He requested clarification. He asked for the specific bylaw provision being enforced. He noted, without editorializing, that similar conditions existed at other homes on the street without similar citations. Vanessa did not read these responses closely. Most of the time she barely read them at all. She tore them in half and dropped them into the recycling bin behind her garage, satisfied that she had the final word simply because she held the clipboard. It was, though she would not realize it for many months, the first real mistake of her presidency. One afternoon, a postal carrier delivering yet another red-sealed envelope to number 18 paused at the door and asked Ethan, almost out of curiosity, why he kept every single letter instead of throwing them away like most people would. He glanced at the growing file boxes visible through the open hallway behind him and raised an eyebrow. Ethan only smiled, the kind of small, unreadable smile of a man who has already decided how a long story is going to end. Professional habit, he said, and closed the door gently, leaving the question to hang unanswered in the summer air, the way so many other things about him were about to hang unanswered until the moment he chose to answer them all at once. There were smaller moments during that period that nobody thought much of at the time, moments that would later look, in hindsight, like the first cracks forming beneath Vanessa's authority. A young couple who had moved in 2 streets over mentioned, in passing at a community yard sale, that they had also received a citation for a mailbox shade that seemed identical to the approved color swatch. They had paid the fine without argument, assuming it was simply bad luck, unaware that a quiet man, 3 houses down, was beginning to notice how often such coincidences seemed to cluster around properties that had, for one reason or another, fallen out of Vanessa's favor. Ethan began adding these small anecdotes to his files as well, not as formal complaints, since none of the affected homeowners were willing to go on record, but as context, threads he suspected might one day connect into something larger than his own individual case. 15 years before any of this happened, Ethan Brooks had built a career most of Ashford Point would have been astonished to learn about. He had designed residential communities up and down the coast, planned subdivisions that balanced density with green space, consulted on some of the thorniest property disputes in the region. For a stretch of years, he had specialized in something narrow and unglamorous but immensely useful, advising homeowners associations and the residents who fought them on the exact boundary between legitimate enforcement and abuse of authority. He had read more governing documents, more bylaws, more state statutes on common interest communities than most attorneys ever would. And then, for reasons he rarely discussed with anyone, he had stepped away from that career entirely, sold his stake in the firm that bore his name, and settled into a quiet life that asked nothing of him except the occasional mowed lawn. Nobody in Ashford Point knew any of this. To Vanessa, he registered only as an easy mark, a solitary man in late middle age who would not have the energy or the resources to fight back. She read his silence as weakness. She read his politeness as surrender already in progress. It never once occurred to her that a man who refuses to argue might simply be a man who has already decided that arguments are the wrong tool for the job he is quietly doing instead. While Vanessa filled her red envelopes, Ethan filled his back room. Every violation notice was logged by date and time. Every fine was cross-referenced against the actual governing documents to check whether it had any legal basis at all. He photographed his own lawn, his own mailbox, his own porch light on the same days each citation was issued, building a visual record that would make it easy, later, for anyone to compare his property against the language used in each accusation. He kept a folder of his own written responses, each one dated, each one sent by a method that generated proof of delivery. He noted the names of neighbors who complained privately that they, too, had received unfair citations, in case their testimony might one day matter. 97 incidents, not a single detail missing. It became clear, to anyone who might have been paying close attention, that Ethan was not simply enduring the campaign against him. He was documenting it with the discipline of someone building a case, the kind of case that requires patience rather than anger, evidence rather than confrontation. He was not waiting for an opportunity to retaliate. He was waiting for a number, a threshold, a volume of documented incidents large enough that no reasonable person could mistake it for ordinary enforcement. He was waiting to prove, beyond any argument Vanessa or her allies could offer, that what had happened to him was not oversight. It was a pattern. And patterns, unlike isolated complaints, are very difficult to explain away in front of people whose job it is to notice them. Ethan's former career had left him with more than legal knowledge. It had left him with an understanding of the psychology behind people like Vanessa, the kind of person who mistakes compliance for consent and silence for surrender. He had watched the same story unfold in a dozen other communities over the years, always with the same early chapters. A board member accumulates just enough authority to feel untouchable. Nobody challenges the small overreaches because each one, taken alone, seems too minor to fight. By the time the overreaches accumulate into something undeniable, the person responsible has usually convinced themselves that their judgment and the rules are the same thing. He recognized the pattern in Vanessa within the first few months of her attention turning toward him, and recognizing it, he understood that confrontation early on would accomplish nothing except giving her a story to tell about the difficult, aggressive homeowner who refused to cooperate. Documentation, quiet and thorough, was the only strategy that would eventually matter. Vanessa's confidence, meanwhile, curdled into something more reckless. Convinced that 97 letters had softened Ethan enough, she decided the moment had come to end things decisively. She proposed and then simply announced a fine of $25,000 against house number 18, citing what she called a pattern of repeated noncompliance. It was an enormous sum for a homeowners association fine, wildly out of proportion to anything the governing documents actually authorized, and it was not, in fact, something Vanessa had any legal right to impose on her own. The association's bylaws required board approval for fines above a modest threshold, a vote recorded in minutes, a process open to challenge. Vanessa skipped all of it. She drafted the fine herself, backdated a clause into the community handbook that had never actually been adopted by the board, and altered the minutes of a prior meeting to suggest the board had already approved sweeping new enforcement powers. It was fraud dressed up as paperwork, the kind of thing that works perfectly well, right up until someone with the patience to check the paperwork actually does. One board member, a soft-spoken accountant named Harold Whitfield, who had grown increasingly uneasy over the preceding months, objected when he saw the altered minutes. He said, quietly but firmly, that he did not recall the board voting on any such authority. Vanessa's response was immediate and cold. "If you do not sign off on this," she told him, "I will make sure you lose your house the same way I am about to make him lose his." Harold said nothing further in that meeting. But that night, sitting at his own kitchen table with far more dread than satisfaction, he began quietly copying every email Vanessa had sent him, every version of the meeting minutes, every file that documented how the fine had actually come into being. He did not know yet what he intended to do with any of it. He only knew that he could no longer pretend not to see what he had seen. Within the week, hesitant and half convinced he was making a mistake, Harold reached out to the one person on the street who seemed, against all expectation, capable of doing something useful with the truth. He reached out to Ethan Brooks. Their first conversation took place on Ethan's porch, in the same rocking chair Vanessa had once cited as a violation of aesthetic harmony. Harold brought a folder of printed emails, his hands unsteady as he laid them across the small table between them, and admitted, almost apologetically, that he did not know whether any of it would actually matter. Ethan read through the documents slowly and carefully, asking precise questions about dates and about who else had been present in the room when certain decisions were made. He did not promise Harold anything dramatic. He simply thanked him, told him the information was valuable, and asked whether he would be willing to preserve everything exactly as it was, without alteration, in case it was ever needed. Harold agreed, relieved in a way he had not expected to feel, as though the weight of silence he had been carrying for months had finally found somewhere safe to rest. The response, when it finally arrived at Vanessa's door, did not come the way she expected. There was no shouting match at a board meeting, no angry homeowner storming into her driveway. Instead, an attorney representing Ethan sent a formal letter to the association requesting a wide set of records. The letter asked for the complete violation history of house number 18, alongside the violation histories of comparable properties on the same street, for the minutes of every board meeting held over the preceding 2 years, for an accounting of association funds, and for documentation showing the legal basis of the $25,000 fine. It was measured, procedural, entirely without threat, and for that reason far more unsettling than any confrontation could have been. In the days between the attorney's letter arriving and the board's formal response, Vanessa held a private conversation with her closest ally on the board, a retired insurance adjuster named Roger Pruitt, who had rarely questioned any decision she made in all their years serving together. She told him she was not worried, that homeowners associations enjoyed broad discretion, and that no court would waste its time second-guessing routine property standards enforcement. Roger, reading the letter more carefully than she had, pointed out that the request specifically named comparable properties and asked why house number 18 alone had accumulated so many citations, while others nearby, with arguably similar conditions, had received none. Vanessa dismissed the question with a wave of her hand, insisting that consistency was not the same thing as leniency, and that she had simply been more thorough than her predecessors. Roger did not press further that day, but the exchange stayed with him longer than either of them realized at the time. Vanessa's first instinct was refusal, she told the board, with the same confidence that had carried her through a decade of unchallenged authority, that she knew the law and that homeowners associations were not obligated to open their books to anyone who asked. It was the kind of statement that sounds authoritative right up until someone checks it against an actual statute. In this particular state, associations were legally required to provide members with access to financial records and meeting minutes upon request, and a refusal to do so was itself treated as a violation, one that could expose both the association and its officers to liability. Ethan's attorney knew this well. The letter had been drafted with that exact statute cited in its opening paragraph. When the association's initial refusal arrived in writing, the attorney's office did not escalate to shouting or to threats of its own. It escalated to process, which in the end proved far more dangerous to Vanessa than any argument could have been. A follow-up letter arrived, this one accompanied by a formal demand under the relevant open records statute, warning that continued non-compliance would result in a petition to the court. For the first time in 10 years, Vanessa Caldwell felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not annoyance, not irritation at an uncooperative homeowner, but something closer to fear, the recognition that the story she had been telling herself about her own untouchable authority might not survive contact with people who actually understood the rules better than she did. The morning it happened began like any other. Vanessa walked to her mailbox in her robe, coffee in hand, expecting the usual mixture of catalogs and community newsletters. Instead, tucked among the ordinary mail, was a plain white envelope, heavier than the others, official in a way that made her pause before opening it. It was not a bill. It was not a letter from the association's own management company. It carried no red seal, no clipboard-stamped urgency, none of the visual language she herself had spent a decade weaponizing. It was instead a civil complaint, formally filed and formally served, listing her by name as a defendant. She read the caption at the top of the first page 3 times before the words fully registered, her own name printed beside the word defendant in a font that felt colder than anything she had ever mailed to house number 18. For 10 years, she had been the one drafting official language, the one deciding which words carried weight and which complaints deserved dismissal. Standing barefoot on her own driveway in the early morning light, she understood for the first time what it felt like to be on the other end of a process she had always assumed was hers alone to control. The allegations, laid out with clinical precision across several pages, were more serious than anything she had imagined facing. Targeted harassment, abuse of authority, falsification of association records, discriminatory and selective enforcement of community rules, breach of fiduciary duty owed to the homeowners she had been elected to serve. Attached to the complaint were exhibits, dozens of them, each one numbered and cross-referenced. 97 violation notices, 97 calm, documented responses, photographs, delivery receipts, copies of comparable properties that had received no citations at all for the exact same conditions cited against house number 18. It was not an argument built on anger. It was an argument built on 97 months of patient record-keeping, assembled with the precision of a man who had spent years teaching other people how these disputes were won and lost. Standing at her own mailbox in her robe, Vanessa Caldwell read the first page twice, then a third time, and felt the ground shift beneath a decade of certainty she had never once thought to question. The lawsuit, once filed, opened a door that could not be closed again, and behind that door was the association's financial history, which turned out to be far messier than anyone but Vanessa had realized. As the discovery process moved forward, records surfaced showing personal expenses quietly folded into community funds over the years. A private attorney retained, at times, for matters that had nothing to do with association business but everything to do with Vanessa's personal disputes. Catered parties billed as community events that few residents could recall attending. Travel expenses linked to conferences that bore only the loosest connection to homeowners' association business. None of it had been enormous in any single instance, which was precisely how it had gone unnoticed for so long, small enough each time to slip past a board that trusted her, small enough to be dismissed as an oversight if anyone ever asked. Added together across the years of her presidency, the total was not small at all. One line item in particular drew audible gasps when it was read aloud during the emergency meeting. A weekend retreat, framed in the association's records as a leadership planning session, had in fact been a private getaway at a lakeside resort for Vanessa and two close friends, billed entirely to community funds under a vague category labeled administrative development. Another entry showed a recurring monthly payment to a personal attorney unrelated to any association matter, disguised for years within a broader legal services line that no board member had ever thought to question closely. Residents who had spent years scraping together fine payments over trivial infractions now understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically uncomfortable, exactly where some of that money had actually gone. When these figures were presented at an emergency meeting called by several alarmed board members, the reaction in the room was immediate, and unlike anything Vanessa had experienced in a decade of leadership. Homeowners who had quietly complied with her citations for years, afraid of becoming her next target, suddenly found their voices. Questions came from every direction, sharper and more specific than she knew how to answer. For the first time since she had taken the position, the room was not looking to her for direction. It was looking past her, toward the quiet man who had, until recently, been little more than a name on 97 envelopes. Ethan attended that meeting in person, something he had rarely done in all his years living on the street. He did not raise his voice. He did not gloat, and he did not once mention the years of fines that had targeted him specifically. Instead, he laid out, calmly and methodically, a timeline built from his own careful documentation alongside the records Harold had preserved, showing exactly how the $25,000 fine had been fabricated, exactly how the meeting minutes had been altered, exactly how association funds had been diverted for personal use. He answered every question directly, without embellishment, letting the document speak louder than any accusation he might have made himself. By the end of the meeting, the board had heard enough. A vote was called, and by a wide margin, Vanessa Caldwell was suspended from her position as president, effective immediately, pending the outcome of both an internal association review and the civil case already working its way through the courts. Before the trial itself, there was a mediation session that Vanessa's attorney had pushed hard to arrange, hoping a private settlement might spare his client the public exposure of a courtroom. Ethan attended, along with his own attorney, and sat quietly while the mediator explained the process. When it came time for the association's side to make an opening offer, the number was modest, a fraction of what the documented harm actually justified, accompanied by a request that Ethan sign a confidentiality agreement preventing him from discussing any of it publicly afterward. Ethan declined without hesitation. He explained calmly that the point had never been about money, and that he had no interest in a resolution that allowed the truth of what happened to disappear, along with a check. The mediation ended within the hour, and the case proceeded toward trial, exactly as his attorney had quietly expected it would. The court proceedings that followed stretched across several tense months, and Vanessa's attorney did his best with the material available to him, which was not very much. His central argument, repeated in various forms throughout the case, was that everything his client had done constituted ordinary, if occasionally overzealous, rule enforcement, the kind of diligence any homeowners association president might reasonably exercise in defense of community standards. It was a difficult argument to sustain against 97 citations issued to a single household over 11 months, each one smaller and more trivial than the last, while comparable violations at other properties on the same street went entirely unaddressed. Ethan's attorney built the opposing case around exactly that asymmetry, walking the court through a timeline supported by dated photographs, delivery-confirmed correspondence, and testimony from neighbors, including Harold, who described both the altered board minutes and the threat Vanessa had made against him personally when he hesitated to comply. One afternoon of testimony proved especially difficult for Vanessa to sit through. A neighbor from 3 houses down, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Ashford Point even longer than Vanessa herself, described watching a citation issued against her own overgrown hedge quietly disappear from the association's records within days, after she mentioned to Vanessa in passing that her nephew worked at the county courthouse. She had assumed at the time it was simple luck. Sitting in the witness chair, she said she now understood it had never been luck at all, only the same selective enforcement that had been aimed at Ethan Brooks, with far greater intensity, because he had no similarly useful nephew to mention. The comparison, delivered without any apparent malice, landed harder in the courtroom than any accusation Ethan's attorney could have constructed on his own. The pattern that emerged was difficult for anyone in the courtroom to dismiss as coincidence. At one point, reviewing the volume and pettiness of the citations laid out before her, the presiding judge asked a question that seemed to hang in the air longer than any other moment in the proceedings. She asked whether what she was looking at represented legitimate community management or a sustained campaign of personal harassment conducted under the cover of an official title. Neither Vanessa nor her attorney offered an answer that satisfied the question, and the silence that followed said more than any argument could have. When the ruling finally came, it left little room for interpretation. The court found that Vanessa had acted well outside the authority granted to her by the association's governing documents, that she had knowingly falsified board records to manufacture the appearance of approval for actions the board had never actually sanctioned, and that her conduct toward House Number 18 constituted a deliberate pattern of harassment rather than good faith enforcement of community standards. Critically, the court also ruled that she would bear personal financial responsibility for the resulting judgment, rather than allowing the association's insurance or shared funds to absorb the cost of her individual misconduct, a distinction that mattered enormously once the final numbers were calculated. Those numbers were substantial. Damages awarded to Ethan Brooks, reimbursement of his legal fees, a permanent injunction barring Vanessa from ever again holding an officer position within any homeowners association in the state, a separate referral for investigation into the falsified board records, a matter serious enough to carry potential criminal exposure well beyond the civil judgment already rendered against her. To satisfy even a portion of what she now personally owed, Vanessa was forced to take out a loan against her own home, the very kind of property she had spent a decade holding to a standard nobody else could ever quite meet. News of the ruling spread through Ashford Point faster than any newsletter Vanessa had ever circulated. Homeowners who had spent years quietly paying fines they privately believed were unjust began comparing notes for the first time, discovering just how widespread the pattern had actually been. Several of them, emboldened by what the court had found, filed their own smaller claims seeking reimbursement for citations that, in light of everything now public, looked far less like enforcement and far more like the same convenient targeting Ethan had endured. The association's insurer, facing a growing number of related claims, opened its own internal review, and for the first time in a decade, the woman who had once controlled every clipboard, every fine, every red envelope on the street found herself on the receiving end of scrutiny she had no way to talk her way out of. Her personal life absorbed its own quiet damage alongside the financial judgment. The vest and clipboard that had once made her recognizable at a glance around the neighborhood disappeared from her morning walks entirely. Former allies on the board, the same people who had once nodded along at her meetings without question, stopped returning her calls. At the grocery store where she had once reminded strangers that nobody wins against the association, she now found herself the subject of hushed conversation instead. The cautionary tale other homeowners association presidents in nearby communities began quietly citing to their own boards as an example of exactly how far things could go wrong when authority went unchecked for too long. Harold Whitfield, whose quiet decision to copy those first altered documents had set the entire process in motion, found himself thanked publicly at the emergency meeting that followed the ruling, something he accepted with visible discomfort. He had never wanted recognition, only relief from the years of unease he had felt watching Vanessa operate with no accountability. When a younger board member asked him why he had waited so long before coming forward, Harold admitted that fear had kept him silent longer than he was proud of, the same fear that had kept every other resident of Ashford Point quiet while 97 letters piled up at a single address. He said he hoped the new governing structure would make that particular kind of fear unnecessary going forward, so that no one would ever again have to choose between speaking up and protecting their own home. In the weeks that followed, Several neighbors who had spent years quietly avoiding Ethan out of fear of becoming Vanessa's next target found themselves knocking on his door instead, offering apologies for the silence they had maintained while watching him absorb blow after blow alone. He accepted each apology with the same steady calm that had carried him through 97 letters, offering no bitterness in return. When one neighbor asked whether he felt any satisfaction at finally seeing Vanessa held accountable, he considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said he had never wanted revenge, only fairness, only a system that applied its own rules evenly instead of according to whoever happened to be holding the clipboard. One neighbor pressed further, asking whether he had ever considered simply moving away during those 11 months, the way so many of Vanessa's earlier targets had done before him. Ethan admitted that the thought had crossed his mind more than once, especially on the harder days, but that leaving would have meant letting the pattern continue unchallenged against whoever moved into house number 18 next. Staying, documenting, and eventually speaking through evidence rather than anger had felt, to him, like the only way to make sure the story actually changed instead of simply relocating to someone else's mailbox. In the months after the ruling, the association moved to elect a new president, a soft-spoken schoolteacher named Diane Marsh, who had lived on the street for over a decade and who made it clear from her first address to the community that things would be done differently going forward. The governing documents were rewritten with input from an outside attorney, closing the loopholes that had allowed one person to accumulate so much unchecked authority in the first place. A new rule required any fine above a modest amount to receive full board approval, recorded and available for any homeowner to review. Meeting minutes would now be published in full rather than summarized at the president's discretion. A formal appeals process was created, giving any homeowner who received a citation the right to challenge it before an independent panel rather than simply accepting whatever the president decided. Financial statements would be shared with the full membership each quarter, instead of surfacing only when someone forced the issue through a lawsuit. Ethan was asked, more than once, whether he wanted to join the newly reformed board himself, given everything he now understood about the community's governing structure, and everything he had once understood, professionally, about how these systems were supposed to work. He declined each time, gently but firmly. He had never wanted a title, and he was careful to explain that the reforms should not depend on any single person's willingness to serve, since that dependence was precisely the flaw that had allowed one determined individual to accumulate so much unchecked power in the first place. What mattered, he told Diane during one of their early conversations, was that the system itself no longer relied on the good character of whoever happened to be holding the position. Rules that only work when the right person enforces them are not really rules at all, he said. They are just permission waiting for someone to misuse it. Diane took the observation seriously enough to bring it back to the newly reformed board, and over the following months, additional safeguards were added beyond the initial round of reforms. Term limits were introduced for the presidency, ensuring no single person could hold the position for anything close to a decade again. An independent ombudsperson role was created, someone outside the board entirely, tasked with reviewing enforcement patterns twice a year to catch exactly the kind of selective targeting that had gone unnoticed for so long under Vanessa. Homeowners were given the right to request an outside audit of association finances at any time, rather than waiting for a lawsuit to force transparency that should have existed from the beginning. Slowly, deliberately, Ashford Point rebuilt itself into a community where authority answered to structure rather than the other way around. He returned to his quiet life at house number 18, mowing his lawn on the same schedule he always had, tending the old maple tree that had outlasted every president the association had ever known, sitting some evenings on the porch chair that had once been cited as a violation of aesthetic harmony. On one of the last afternoons of that long, strange season, the postal carrier arrived at his door carrying nothing more than a magazine and a coupon flyer, the first delivery in nearly a year that did not contain a single red-sealed envelope. She smiled as she handed it over, remarking that his mailbox finally looked like everyone else's. Inside his house, in the room that had once held 97 carefully organized files, the old red envelopes were finally fed one by one into a paper shredder. The machine's steady hum, the only sound marking an ending, that had taken 11 months of quiet documentation and several more months of patient litigation to finally arrive. Unlimited power, left unchecked long enough, will always tip over into abuse. But it only takes one person, patient enough to keep every letter, careful enough to preserve every record, willing enough to wait for the truth to speak for itself, to bring an entire system back into balance.